I would like to introduce Erika Holst, who is our curator of art of history here at the Illinois State Museum, and she is going to be presenting our program tonight, and I'll let her take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. Normally, in these types of programs, we have been live in the gallery, but because of the rising number of coronavirus cases, we thought it would be safer if we were all remote tonight, so you're getting a PowerPoint presentation instead, and I went in and took photos of the exhibit. So I'll try to tie it back to the exhibit. The exhibit in question, of course, is, there we go, Fashioning Illinois, 1820 to 1900, which is the Illinois State Museum's exhibition that features women's clothing from that time period, not just examples of clothing on display, but talking about what it meant to make and wear and care for clothing and the different types of occasions that women would wear things to. The original run date of this show was from March 21st, 2020 to January 10th of this year. Of course, we all know that nothing this year has turned out like we expected it to. So the current run date is July of this year, and it will run through May of next year. So you still have 5 full months of 2021 to get in to see it if you have not seen it yet already. So in this talk tonight, we're going to be talking about the process of caring for clothing. One of the things this exhibition wanted to accomplish was, again, go beyond displaying dresses to really dig into what did it mean to have these clothes for a woman in the 19th century? What kind of time and labor and money was invested in them, and how did clothing affect her everyday life? And the answer is, to a much greater degree than we in the 21st century are impacted by our clothes. It occupied a lot of women's time, a lot of their thoughts, and tonight we're going to be talking about the investment in maintaining a woman's wardrobe. So if you turned into the last talk, we talked about making clothing and how most women would make their personal linens, often their husband's shirts, their children's clothing. They often worked closely with the seamstress to make things that required a more precise fit, like bodices or their finer garments, but women had a hand in all their clothing. Today we're talking about how women mended those clothes, made them over, washed them, and recycled them. So we're starting with mending clothing, and wanted again to reiterate that women sewed in the 19th century. And there's this wonderful quote by the writer of The Young Lady's Friend, a domestic advice manual from 1849, where she said, "A woman who does not know how to sew is as deficient in her education as a man who cannot write." And as this wonderful image shows here, it was often a skill set that was passed on from women in a family. You know, a mother or grandmother or aunt or sister would put a needle in the hands of a little one, and the little one would be taught to sew. And she would start with maybe doll clothes or some straight seams, what was called plain sewing. And then gradually she might move up to fancy embroidery work if she was more affluent. If not, she would have, from a very young age, the basic skills needed to maintain her household's textiles. And she would have been put into service by her mother at a fairly young age to help with mending and darning and maintaining those textiles. So on the right, we have this example of a darning sampler, and it's hard to see because it's white on white, so a lot of the details aren't going to show up, but it is embroidered with the date 1893. And so this is a textile that a young girl made, and it was meant to show off her plain sewing skills. She's made buttonholes, she's made loops that could catch a hook and eye. Dead center, there's a patch, there's an example of darning down below that, attaching a button. So these are all kind of the useful stitches that would have been part of her skill set that she would have used to repair the clothing that her and her family would have worn. So keeping in mind, in the 19th century, people had a lot less clothes than we do today, and they put them through much greater wear. They were much less sedentary in general than we are. They would have been out walking, they would have been out riding, they would have been working in a much more physically active way, and their clothing bore the brunt of it. So mending was a part of life. Things got holes, you know, like Joe and Little Women, they would stand too close to the fireplace maybe, and sparks would land on their dress and they'd get little holes on it. A million different things could happen to do a ripped seam or a hole or a tear or a worn patch. So everybody's clothes were mended. And this is true throughout the social classes. And probably working people's clothes are mended to a degree that we sort of can't imagine today. And one amazing discovery that turned up within the past 5 or 10 years or so was in a chimney in England. These pants had been stuffed up in that chimney. They date to the early 19th century, and it's unclear if they were put up there to kind of protect against draft, or there's even a suggestion of they might have been sort of a ritual protection against evil in the household. But if you look at these pants, it is patch upon patch upon patch upon patch. It's almost hard to tell where the original pants stop and the patches begin. And this was, again, kind of a way of life because textiles were precious. The pants were precious. They were not going to be discarded because they had a rip. They were going to be worn and as much useful life as possible wrung out of them. And so with mending as a part of everyday life and the understanding that everybody's clothes would have been mended to some degree, I want to take a little bit of a detour here into depictions of mending in popular visual culture, just because there's kind of an interesting subtext that goes along with it. So if you look at genre art, that is art that depicts scenes of everyday life from America in the 19th century, you start to see a pattern emerge, and pants in genre, or patches and mending in genre art are meant to signify sort of kind of an other status. Now keep in mind that in these types of paintings, they're highly symbolic, so every detail that's included is meant to convey part of the story that's being told in the painting. And so these are the one on the left is a detail from the county election by George Caleb Bingham. So this is a small detail of a larger painting. The man there, it's a county election. There's a lot of whiskey being passed around, and the man in the center with the green pants there is intoxicated, and you can see his pants are patched at the knee. The central image is called Art versus Law by David Gilmore Blythe, and it's something of a self-portrait. That's the artist himself there, and he is returning to his artist studio only to see that the lawyers or the county sheriff have put a notice on that says his studio space is to let. Basically, he's been evicted. And so he's the struggling artist who's already kind of economically on the margins. And you can see that his pants are patched, his clothes are patched, his elbow is torn. So those mends and patches are meant to sort of reinforce his sort of borderline status there. And then the last painting on the right is called The Power of Music by William Sidney Mount. And again, this is a detail of a larger scene, but it's an African-American gentleman, and he's listening to music being played inside. And the artist has very carefully drawn the distinction between the African-American gentleman who's on the outsides, he's on the margins of this group and listening in, and the white people inside form this very sort of tight group listening inside. And again, the African-American gentleman has a patched coat and patched overalls. So in all three of these scenes, patches are meant to signify this kind of like borderline other status. Patches are not necessarily a total value judgment. They're sort of sort of a liminal state, because a patch also does indicate that you're trying, right? You know, someone has fixed your clothes, so you could theoretically be on the way up or you could be on the way down. Genre art has a different take on torn clothes. Torn clothes really are associated with someone who are objects of scorn or pity or fear. And this group of boys from 1894, this is called The Gang by John George Brown. It's sort of meant to evoke all of it. This is this case of these ragged street children, and you can see the kids have torn clothing, and they sort of are, you know, this gang running wild, and there's kind of this implication of like, what are they going to be when they grow up? And you can see in the corner there's a young woman, it might be a sister or a mother, who's sort of like clutching the younger child to her in fear as this gang of boys pass. And so there's sort of this silent indictment of women here, and it's interesting to read into the expectations, being that mending was typically a gendered activity, unless you're a soldier off to war, in which you'd mend your own clothes. But typically it's fell to a woman to do the mending. And so these boys running wild with their torn and dirty clothes, there's sort of a little value judgment, like, where's this kid's mother? You know, there's an implied judgment of a failing at home. And so conversely, there's sort of this societal ascription to women that they're mending, not just the physical mending of clothes, but it sort of speaks to a sort of symbolic being able to mend, you know, someone's character, someone's soul through guidance and proper influence and religious kind of like an example set. And there's this great story that was published in the newspaper as sort of a serial story in 1860. It was called The Worst Pupil. And it's about an orphan boy who comes to school, and the school marm sort of takes an interest in him. And this boy is ragged, barefoot, and hatless. And everyone tells the school marm, oh, watch out for this kid. He's totally trouble. He's so disruptive. But the school marm takes interest in him and is very kind to him. And she tries to get him to Sunday school, but he says he can't because his clothes are too ragged. So she mends his coat, and there's this little exchange from the story that I'll read to you. Someone says, what do you have there? And she says, why, it's Willie's jacket. I've promised to mend it for him so he can go to Sunday school tomorrow. Mercy on me, but you can never mend that ragged thing. Oh, yes, I can. Where can I find some patches? And so clearly the symbolic subtext is beyond just you can't mend that jacket, like you can't mend that boy, he's too far gone. And she says, oh, yes, I can. And she mends the jacket, and he goes to Sunday school, and then he gets adopted by the deacon. He finishes school, goes to theological school, and becomes a minister. So, you know, the power of mending runs deep there. So I digressed just a little bit, but I think this is sort of an interesting topic that bears further study. And again, in popular culture, this is an example of a portrait from the 1830s. And so in portraits and idealized images of people, there are no mends to be seen. There's no tears. Their children are all in pristine, clean, white clothes. So the presentation of clothing absolutely free from visible flaw is an important symbol of respectability and character and refinement. Again, this is an idealized view, though, because, as we mentioned before, everyone's clothes were mended. And we know that for a fact because of this coat, which belongs to none other than Thomas Jefferson. It dates to about 1800. So this is when Jefferson has been elected President of the United States. And if you look at his overcoat, you can see that his elbows are worn. And in the zoomed in view there, you can see a neat little patch at his elbow. So it's not to say that people of wealth or influence did not mend their clothes. Nope. Everyone did. It was kind of just the degree and skill to which things were mended. So again, all women mended, rich or poor, old or young. This is a fact of life. If someone was well off, they still mended because women who could hire domestic help tended to foist the things like cooking and scrubbing that were more physically taxing and were sort of dirtier work onto their hired help, and they would do the mending themselves because mending was a sort of genteel activity that you can do sitting down in your favorite chair, less physically taxing. And there's a letter written by a woman named Molly Raymond of Chicago to her sister Helen in 1875. And she closes her letter by saying, "I could go on scribbling for an hour, but my washing has come and I must look over and mend the clothing." So right there in that little snippet, we see that Molly has paid someone else to do her washing, which is really hard, taxing work, and we're going to talk about that later. But she has chosen to mend the clothes herself. That's a duty that she takes on. So the two main types of mending, I just wanted to show you a couple examples from our collection, are to patch something, and to patch something is to fill in a hole with another piece of material. And typically women, when they make their clothes, they will set aside some of the remnants of the fabric and keep it in their sewing basket for future use, knowing full well that at some point they'll need to patch their clothes and will want to have a piece of fabric that matches. And then darning, and darning is typically used for knits, and darning is a process of reweaving to fill in the hole. And I have no sewing skills, but fortunately I know someone who does, and I have invited her to be here tonight. So right now it is my pleasure to introduce Samantha Comerford. She is a master's student in art history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's focusing on textiles, and she's also serving as the interim assistant collections manager of the Helen, Louise, Allen Textile collection at UW-Madison. And she was my intern, so hopefully she remembers me when she makes her mark on the world. But she's very graciously agreed to be here tonight, and Samantha does have wonderful sewing skills. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam, and she's actually going to demonstrate some 19th century style mending using period techniques.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erika. I'm so excited to be here. And you won't see my face, but you'll just see my hands tonight. So I have a fancy rig so that all of you can see what I'm working on. But yeah, so I actually started doing these techniques while working with Erika, as we took in a large collection of 19th century textiles, and I saw that they had been patched and darned, and as somebody who wears through quite a bit of her own clothing, I was interested in making sure that I could preserve my own clothing. So two things. Oh, it looks like maybe it's going to be easier if Erika takes down the PowerPoint so that everybody can see me really large. Perfect. And I think if you hold down on the thing and pin my video, hopefully you can see me really big. So yeah, so I'm going to show you some darning techniques. I've started on this sock already. Hopefully you can see. I am not a very neat darner necessarily, but I work really hard to use the same techniques that are seen in some of the textiles in the exhibit that Erika has done. So I'm going to show you from start to sort of finish how I got sort of to this place, and then we'll pick up where I left off. So the first thing I'll start with is sort of what's in my sewing basket. I always have a pair of scissors. This pair is on a string so that I can actually wear them around my neck, so I always have them with me. I also keep a variety of needles. When you're darning, you're generally working with knit fabrics, so things like socks, fabrics that have been knit or are stretch. So one type of needle that I suggest is using a ballpoint needle. This is a fairly large one. And it's harder to tell because this camera's not huge, but this needle does not come to a point. So when going through fabrics, it will not pierce a hole, but will rather go through the weave of the fabric and won't puncture your fabric. So if you're working with historic textiles or things like that, it's much nicer for preservation and things like that. So that's for darning. However, for the darning I'm doing tonight, I'm actually going to be using a sharp needle. So this one comes to a point and it has a larger eye hole. And I'm using that one because I'm using a thicker yarn to darn these socks that I'm working on. And so I need some type of needle that has a large enough eye for me to put the worsted wool yarn through it. So those are the needles that I use, and scissors. As far as the fiber that I use for darning socks, I like to use something similar to what initially was used for the socks, but you can use a wide variety of things. So I'm also an avid knitter, and so I have quite a bit of wool on hand. So this is just a worsted wool yarn and is what I'm using tonight. There's also cotton yarns, or you can use things like cotton embroidery floss. And I have a pair of tights here that I've darned using cotton embroidery floss. So these are wool tights, but I've used embroidery floss because I wanted them to be kind of colorful. So you have a wide variety of materials you can use. And then the last thing I would say is if you can get your hands on one, a darning egg is a hugely valuable piece of equipment. You can also use a clementine or an orange. I think they call these darning eggs. It's my belief or my understanding that they call these darning eggs because people used to use real eggs, but I can get a little rough sometimes with these things, so I'd worry that an egg would crack. But darning eggs are great. You can find them oftentimes in like antique or thrift stores, or I found mine in my great-grandmother's sewing box. So they're valuable. And this one has a handle, which is really, really nice. And darning eggs are used specifically for the rounded parts of your socks. So if you're going to be rebuilding a heel or the toe, they're a great way to stretch over things. Oh, and I saw that somebody in the comments said a light bulb. I have heard of people doing that as well. So that's really neat. But if you are darning over the toe, what you're going to be doing is stretching over that egg. And so that you'll be able to rebuild in a rounded way. But the area that I am working on is fairly flat. So I just use my hand instead to do that. So you can see that there's a hole here, and what you do when darning is just rebuild the weave. So all I'm going to be doing is reweaving this section. So first step in reweaving is to create your warp threads, which are your vertical threads going through your sock. So I'm going to start well above my sock area. And as I said before, I can be kind of a sloppy darner. There are people that are far neater than I am, and there are methods that are far different from my own. But this is just sort of how I've learned to do it, through observation and through reading some of those older sewing manuals, like Erika said. But and the other thing I should note is that I always start wrong side out. So the inside of the sock is what's facing up now. That's how they practiced it in a lot of these historic sewing manuals, I think partly so that you can leave your ends inside. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and go in and out all the way up to my hole. And I'm starting in the middle so that I can show you all just how I create those warp threads. And I'm gonna pull it all the way through. And you'll see I have no knot. I do not knot threads when darning. That leaves them. They'll get, as you wash and wear your socks, they'll actually get worn into the weave. So I'm gonna keep going in. And then once I get to my hole, I go ahead and just leave it straight across. Pull it through, got my egg, pull it through, and then I'm going to leave this thread all the way that way to create a warp. And again, I'm going to go quite a bit up above my hole so that I'm really reinforcing that way, that whole hole, so that these can be worn for many, many, many more years. And then I'm going to go next to that again. There's no concern about necessarily over under here like we would when we're weaving. But we'll go ahead and pull through. And one thing to note here is that you want to try and keep your tension as even as possible. And it's what will make your loom really perfect. So I'm going to keep going like this, and I'll just do about 3 of these, and then I'll move over to my other sock so that you all can see how this works. So there you can see I have 2 warp threads. Yes, and just so everybody knows, the tension is how tight the thread is. So this one, you can see they're about even verticals. So that's how I want to keep those threads so that it's easier for me to weave in the long run. So yeah, the tension is just how taut you're keeping those threads. So again, just pulling through. You can see they're all about the same length, which is really helpful. So yeah, so I'm just gonna keep doing that all the way across my hole. And because we only have an hour tonight, I won't walk you through the whole thing, but this is how I would create my warp threads for my darning. But I have a sock that I have already done this on. And you can see here that I've already created my warp threads here. So I have vertical threads going all the way across. So I kept going vertical, 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 all the way across this sock. And now I'm going to start creating my woven part, or the threads that go horizontal. And this is what we call the weft. So here, I'm going to start again, just like we did before with the warp threads, from this side of the sock, starting from a little bit to the side of the hole, going into the fabric that's not already warp. Yes, it's warp threads. So yeah, and I'm just gonna pull again so that I have an end. And then here, it's actually really important to look kind of close up. And this is where it becomes important to remember what you did before. So here, you can see that I have woven some of these threads, and I need to do the opposite each time. So I'm going to go, I went under here, I'm gonna go over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, and out of my hole. So I'm just creating, I've created a loom, and now I am just pulling through so that you can see I've created another weft thread. And sometimes you'll notice that there are small holes here. Sometimes those are worked out, like people are saying, these will start to sort of naturally adhere as you wash and wear them. Also, you can go in and reweave things. So if I go back up and I realize like, oh, there's a little bit too much air in between some of these, I can go back in and reweave them. But I'm just gonna keep doing that same thing all the way across the sock, pulling through. And again, this time I'm going to go over, under, over, under, over, under. Oops. And using a sharp makes me get caught on some of these wool threads, so another point for using ballpoint needles. But you can see I'm just doing the opposite thing there and pulling through. And there you go. So you can keep pushing those up and keep weaving across the whole bottom of the sock. And this is sort of the top of the heel of the sock. So this will be, you know, a fix that hopefully will last for a long time. And as many of you have said, it will felt itself. It'll start to sort of wear together. I have some other things that I've darned here, like I've showed. This is a pair of tights that I've worn almost to death. But there's a re-darned heel here, so you can see that I've rewoven that. And the toe here as well has been rewoven as well. So yeah, that's some of darning. It's really meditative to do sort of in front of the TV. And so much of our sort of fashion consumption these days happens so quickly. It's a nice way to sort of sit with your clothing and to make the clothing that you purchase last for a really long time. So yeah, and then just quickly, I'm gonna show you a few patched things, and I'm starting to patch a dress right now, so I'm just gonna keep working through that. So for patching, very similar materials. I use scissors. I have inherited a lot of old mercerized cotton threads, so I use a lot of that. And then you'll also need patches. So you can use a variety of different patches. I have denim patches, I have some canvas, some flannel, some cotton, but the best advice I have about patches is use a patch of the same textile of the thing that you're patching. So if you're patching silk, try to use silk. If you're patching cotton, try to use cotton. It's just really helpful in strengthening the integrity of your garment. So yeah, so, and as far as needles, I like to use really small sharps for patching, mostly because I do a lot of what's called a whip stitch throughout the patching process, which I will show you here in just a moment. And so I like to have something small that I can really sort of move more deftly. So I have a patch here. It's in the armpit of a dress. And so that's kind of a funny spot. I ripped the armpit, raising my arms up above the head, up above my head really quickly. So that's what happened there. And I've already attached 3 of the sides using a whip stitch, but I will show you quickly just how I am going to finish up this last corner. So first things first, I cut a patch about maybe an inch larger on each side or a ½ inch larger on each side than my hole was. And I pinned it down to the armpit and just used regular pins all the way around. It's really important to make sure that your patch is as flatly adhered to your fabric as possible, just to create a really seamless and beautiful finish on your patch. And like Erika said, when women were making their own clothing, they would save a bit of the fabric. I bought this dress at a flea market, and I do not have remnants of it, but I found a quilting cotton that's a pretty similar color, and it's in my armpit. So hopefully it won't be seen too much. And I don't really mind the look of visible mending, but that's sort of the choice, the aesthetic choice that I've made as far as my mending. So I'm gonna start here in the center. I have made a small knot at the end of my thread for this. So yeah, so one thing about this is that I'm using a quilting cotton, which is a woven fabric, and it will fray and it will wear away if I do not hem it. So I have folded it under, hopefully you can sort of see that a little bit, just about 1/4 of an inch to create a small hem. So I will not have to contend with any of that fraying in future. So I'm going to enter my needle through my quilting cotton into my fabric and then back out. So just creating like a straight stitch there. And then I'm going to keep doing that into my quilting cotton, into my fabric, and out. Into my quilting cotton, into my fabric, and out. And you'll see, hopefully, that I'm creating these kind of circular stitches all the way around this patch. And I'll just keep doing that all the way around the patch. And then, yeah, so, and oh, one thing I should note also, this is the wrong side of my dress. So this is the inside of the dress, as Grace is saying. It does make more sense. So you'll always start with the inside. So yeah, this is the wrong side of my dress. So when I flip it out to the right side, which I'm gonna go ahead and trim this thread and do, because my patch is pretty much adhered, I'm going to flip it out to the right side, and you'll see that my hole looks like that. So there you can see it's just a small blue hole. And one thing about holes is you always make it worse before you make it better. So you can see that I have all kinds of fraying that happened in this hole. There's like a seam that runs through it. So what I'm going to do is actually take my scissors and cut away at this hole to clean it up, because I don't really want any of these frayed edges or any of these strings running through the center. So I'm going to go ahead and make it worse so that I can make it better. So just cleaning up some of this hole, any of these frayed edges. So yeah, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the outside that I did on the inside. So again, using my needle, I'm going to tie a quick knot. And I'm going to start from the back to the front. And what I'm going to do on this front side is go ahead and tuck under with my thumb so that I create that tiny hem. Come from the back. And again, make little tiny whip stitches, attaching my fabric to the patch so that I have a seamless finish, or, you know, a really tiny seamed finish. And this is the right side of my dress. So yeah, apologies for not clarifying that earlier on. But yeah, and I'll go all the way around the interior of this dress, or the exterior of this dress, right around the perimeter of this hole, so that it is adhered nice and flat to my patch. I won't have any of this bubbling, and it'll create a nice little patch for my hole right there. And I have a few patches that I've done before here. This is a dress that I got at a thrift store. It's from the 1950s. This I did a little bit of a different patching method because this one had a lot of silk shattering. So I used a piece of silk and I just did a simple running stitch, which allowed me to create a patch for that little hole. And I did something similar for this dress. This was actually my mom's dress, so it's been with all of us for a long time, and it started to have a similar problem down at the bottom. So I actually created some small darns, and then I also had some of these holes, and you can see that they've actually started to fray again, so it's probably about time that I go back with my needle and start to patch those up. But I went ahead and I made this very visible. I wanted this to have kind of a visible mending look. So I created larger stitches around the outside and then smaller ones towards the inside. But that is how I patch and mend my clothing. Like I said, there's a million different ways to do this. And, you know, we've come up with so many technologies that have allowed us to mend our clothing in different sorts of ways. And I know that many of you probably have your own techniques that you use, and I would love to hear them. But yeah, that's just sort of what I've learned through observation. And yeah, so thank you so much to all of you. And I will turn it back over to Erika.
Thank you so much. And as someone who does not sew at all, I found it really instructive, both as, you know, a modern tutorial and also as a way to get into the headspace of 19th century women. I think Sam made such an important comment when she said, you know, it's meditative, and sitting with your clothes, you sort of understand them and feel a deeper connection to them. My mom knew how to sew, and she didn't pass those skills on to me. And so I, you know, have no connection to my clothes and feel the poorer for it, and think sort of we as a society have gone the direction of fast fashion, where, you know, you buy a $10 t-shirt and if one gets a stain on it or a hole, we might just throw it out or give it away. And this isn't great for the environment, and it's not great for sustainability. And so there really is this movement about mending that's sort of resurging. And I love that Sam has made those visible patches, because that really is kind of a thing now, where, you know, people mend and make it visible and sort of elevate the fact that they are being conservation minded and reusing and repurposing clothing. So I love that. I love just that 10-minute, 15-minute glimpse she gave us of the handiwork that would have been part of a woman's everyday life. You know, this would have been sitting down in the evening to do her mending. And you see in women's letters and diaries that there was a degree of, you know, like, okay, this again, you know, like many of us feel like maybe if you're not into cooking, making dinner, or, you know, doing the dishes, it was one of those just endless chores that a woman would face her entire life. So I'm going to go back to the video now. Oops. Yes. Here we go. And I'm going to move on to talking about remaking clothing or making over clothing. And this was, again, a technique that was very common in the 19th century into the 20th and fell away over the course of the 20th century. Again, in my family, it was me. You know, my mother knew how to let things in or do them up or fix them over. And I did not inherit those skills, but this would have been a part of women's skill sets. And again, we have this wonderful quote from, this is the Delineators of Fashion magazine. There are very few who do not renovate and make over their old dresses when they have grown too old-fashioned to be presentable. And again, women's clothing represented the investment of money that it took to purchase the fabric and the investment of time that it took to create the clothing and then again to keep mending it and make it presentable. And so there's no such thing as just discarding a dress. You know, there is sweat equity in that dress. So what women did was rework it and squeeze as much life as possible. So a few of the ways that clothing was made over, probably the most common was to take an existing garment and to make it over for someone smaller than you. So a younger sibling, a child. If a garment was worn, the fabric was worn or frayed, usually enough could be salvaged out of it that you could make clothes for children. And here or actually going back to that short story, the worst pupil from 1860, another little exchange from it is the deacon who ends up adopting him in the end at one point says, well, there are those pants I laid off last week. I guess between the two of you, you could get a boy a decent pair out of them. Oh, yes, indeed, Father. I could cut them over and turn the fronts to back. So, you know, adult clothes turned into children's clothes to extend their life. Another method of making over clothes was kind of in the same principle as cutting down children's clothing or cutting down clothing for children's clothing is cutting apart old garments and reassembling the usable pieces into something new. And this generally might be like, this is a petticoat and it's a quilted petticoat, and on exhibit in the museum, we actually have it turned inside out. So what you're looking at is the underside of it. So you can see at least 4 different sections of fabric that have been pieced together. And so these are undoubtedly remnants from other clothes, and they've salvaged the big workable pieces, put it on the other side, the underside of the petticoat. Once you flip it right side out, it's a continuous pattern on the outside. So no one will ever see that this has been constructed out of repurposed clothing. Another trick was, so if you look at a dress that has a small print, this is an example of a work dress that's in our collection, and it's paired with a photograph of a woman with a small print cotton dress. And so these small cotton prints were ideal for kind of everyday dresses to work dresses because they could be laundered, the cotton could be washed, and also these small prints were kind of busy enough that they would be a little bit forgiving in terms of soiling. And when a print kind of ran the same way upside down, you could cut this apart and you could turn it over if you needed to. Sometimes if it was the same front to back, you could literally cut it apart, flip the fabric inside out, and reassemble it. Catherine Beecher, in her domestic advice manual, recommended that if your dress had worn elbows, that you take the sleeves off and flip them so the inside of the sleeve becomes the outside and the outside becomes the inside of the opposite arms. That way your worn part goes on the inside of the elbow where it's less visible, and the fresh part goes on the outside. And then another trick is trimming. So this photograph of a woman here, she's got this wonderful braid decoration across the top of her bodice and these tassels and the details on her sleeve, and that's considered trim. And this is something that can be relatively easily altered. This is generally just sort of basted on, and you know, this trim might be of the season in 1862 or whenever this photo was taken, and she can just cut cut that off at some point, and she can retrim the bodice without having to kind of rework the entire dress to make it look fresh for a new season when there's, you know, a new fashion of trim that comes out. And she could really, you know, change the appearance of that based on the trim that she added. The trim is also useful because it can hide imperfections in the clothes, and oftentimes on old garments you see trim like that strategically placed over patches or little holes or instances of mending. So it's kind of a way to hide the flaws there. And then finally, another aspect of remaking clothes is literally to take it and rip it apart and reconstruct it. And this was something that happened quite frequently too, as silhouettes changed and as fashions changed. There's a lot of usable material, especially from, you know, the 1860s era, where you might have 8 to 10 yards of fabric in a hoop skirt that's still perfectly serviceable, even if it's not fashionable. And so that's exactly what's happened in this dress in our collection. It came to us mid-alteration, and so what seems to have happened is that it started in the 1860s, and the bodice part of it, the main body of the bodice, has these characteristic, the sloped shoulders and the kind of like V-shaped darts at the bottom are very 1860s. And what's happened is someone has gotten a hold of it, they've cut off the sleeves, they've probably taken fabric from the skirt to make new sleeves. The skirt has been narrowed into an A-line skirt, and the sleeves have been remade to be these puffy leg of mutton sleeves that were popular in the mid-1890s. So what we have here is a dress that was in the process of being made over from something old, you know, it would have been 30 years out of date by the time someone started this project. Fabric still beautiful though, and turned into something that was really quite of the fashion. And we don't know why it was ever put aside and not finished, but we feel lucky to have this because it's such a great illustration of this remaking process. So I'm going to move on to washing clothing. So in the 19th century, we have sort of this, the coming to fruition of this idea that cleanliness is next to godliness. This is an idea that really took hold as sort of industrialization is creeping by, and in colonial times, people tended to save up their laundry for a couple months and then spend a week or more washing it. And then in the 19th century, you have this idea that the cleanliness of your clothing sort of reflects your character and your gentility, and so having clean, presentable clothing becomes much more of a cultural imperative. And again, women are typically the ones who are tasked with doing laundry, and so this burden of making sure that people's clothing reflected their piousness and gentility and godliness fell to women, in a task that one woman described as the great domestic dread of the household. That's the woman who wrote in her diary in 1867 that she was about to start her laundry process. And so laundry was something that once we moved to a once a week type of thing, and it moved to once a week because part of this idea of looking fresh really went down to your undergarments, your petticoats, and especially your chemise, the garments that's worn close to your body. Your collars and cuffs and handkerchiefs are things that were sort of expected to be kind of clean and fresh and starched. And for men, it was their shirts. And all of these instances, they're garments that are worn closest to the body, that are most likely to absorb sweat and oil and grime. And so having them be clean and fresh was really sort of the signal that, like, you were on top of your appearance, you were cleaning your clothes, you know, had that piousness and refinement. And so once a week, laundry would typically be done in a household. And typically this takes place on Mondays because the washing and then ironing and subsequent mending process was lengthy. And so there would be a fresh outfit ready for church. Some people advocated doing laundry on Tuesday. So you could have Sunday as a day of rest, because otherwise if you're going to do laundry on Monday, often clothes would need to be soaked overnight prior. So on a Sunday night, you're filling up your wash tub and getting ready for the next day's laundry. So this is nobody's favorite task at all. It was by far the most labor-intensive process before any mechanization came into play there. And so I'm going to run through, this is from Catherine Beecher's Treatise on Domestic Economy. And so she lays out the process for doing one load of laundry. Keep in mind that households would probably have multiple loads. They would have their whites and their household textiles and their coloreds and all that. So for doing one load of whites, you would sort the clothes and soak overnight, wash clothing in a tub full of suds. And side note, it's estimated that doing laundry involved an average of 50 gallons of water, which translates to 400 pounds of water. And if anyone's ever hauled a bucket of water around, you know, that's no fun to do that to equal 50 gallons. Wring out clothes, turn them inside out, and wash again in a second tub of suds. Put clothing in a bag and boil in strong suds for 1/2 hour. Rub dirty spots as needed. Rinse clothes in a tub of rinse water, then wring out. Dip clothing into a tub of bluing water and wring out. So bluing is just what it sounds like. It's a little bit of blue coloring. And this is because these undergarments that were white tended to yellow with perspiration or with wear. And so adding a little bit of blue in there counteracted that yellow and sort of made a brighter white. This is before bleach, obviously. Dip articles to be stiffened in starch. Okay, so starch is, you know, a starched collar or a starched petticoat. It stiffens the fabric, and it was, again, a sign of gentility. It was kind of a cultural imperative, and we have clothing in the museum that's come to us still starched. So there's a petticoat that's, you feel it, and it's almost like crispy, or like a shirt front feels, you know, like very stiff. And so that's an extra step to your laundry there. Hang clothes in the sun to dry, and repeat the process for each load with variations to account for color, fabric, and degree of soil. So again, if there's a spot on your clothes, you're going to take it out and really try to rub some soap into that spot. In terms of the soap, people generally used lye soap. And this is something that could be made at home from wood ashes combined with animal fats. A lot of women were still making their own soap right up until about the time of the Civil War. After the Civil War, things like starch and bluing and soap became more commercially available. The lye soap would come in bars, which isn't, I mean, it's useful to grab a bar and scrub out a stain, but it's not super useful for making suds. So in the image of the laundry implements there, you can see the soap shaver and the chunks of soap. People would shave their soap into smaller flakes that could be boiled up and turned into the sudsy water. So washing was so much not fun that it acquired the nickname Blue Monday when the wash was typically done. And in a household where, you know, it was all hands on deck with the woman washing and her kids helping out, the husbands got used to the idea of having a cold supper and kind of staying out of the way that day. And so this is sheet music that dates to about the 1830s. We have a copy on display in the museum exhibit, and it's called Blue Monday, and this is, or Washing Day, a proper ballad for wet weather. This is a comic take on the domestic perils of washing day. And some of the lyrics I'll read to you. Says, the sky with clouds was overcast, the rain began to fall. My wife, she whipped the children, who raised a pretty squall. She bade me with a frowning look to get out of her way. Oh, the deuce a bit of comfort's here upon a washing day. And it goes on for stanzas and stanzas. He goes on to say, my Kate, she is a bonny wife. There's none so free from evil, unless upon a washing day, and then she is the devil. And it goes on to say that he brought a friend home to dinner on washing day, you know, oh, Kate won't mind, and Kate minded very much. And the friend asked narrator of this song, when Kate had died and when he had remarried such a scolding vixen. And of course, Kate's very much alive. She has turned into a scolding vixen because it's washing day and it puts her in a short temper. One other little side note I want to dive into about washing day is the prevalence of marking laundry in the 19th century, and I just love this. Every time we get a new donation of clothes, I like to look for a laundry mark on it. So this is the 19th century equivalent of taking a Sharpie and writing your name on your underpants for summer camp. It is literally to claim your personal undergarments as your own, because if you can imagine on laundry day, say there is a house with a woman and her 3 daughters, and all of their undergarments are going into one boiling pot together. And so afterwards, when everyone's petticoats and chemises all look the same, having a laundry mark on it will ensure that the proper garment goes back to the proper person. So the top image shows our little laundry line that's on display in the museum, and then the bottom is a close-up of all the laundry marks on it. So the petticoat says Bell Flag on the waistband. The stays, which date, they're early, they're about 1830s, they have an embroidered E on them. The chemise, I think it's Anna P. Baldwin, might be Laura P. Baldwin. The handkerchief says L.C. Bush, and the drawers there say E.A. Davidson. And they also display the variety of marking methods that were available in the 19th century. Bell and Anna and L.C. Bush have used indelible ink, and that's what's on the very far corner. It's very tiny and hard to see, but there were these indelible ink sets that were available commercially. So they've written their name. The stays have been embroidered, and this is sort of an older technique. You see this a lot in the 18th century, embroidered initials on clothing. And then E.A. Davidson has the latest innovation, which is a stencil. You could go to a printer's or engraver's shop, and they would make you a custom stencil that you could stamp your name on your clothing. And then after the clothes were dried, it was on to ironing. So usually this is the day after wash day. And this again is not a fun process. The ironing board really didn't come into use until the later 19th century. So typically the setup was just a table that was covered with a woolen blanket and then covered again with a cotton or linen sheet. If you were doing something like a bodice or a skirt, there were special bosom boards and skirt boards that would kind of elevate and let you get at the fine details, but typically any horizontal surface would do. Clothes were dampened. The irons would be placed in the fire. So when you talk about having a lot of irons in the fire, if you're working with an open hearth, there would just be a sheet of metal sitting in the fireplace, heating up your irons. If you're working with a cast iron stove, you'd have so anywhere between 3 to 6 irons heating at any one time. They would have to be rubbed with beeswax and wiped before ironing. This helped the iron not to stick to starched garments. And then they'd have to be tested because they needed to be hot enough, but not so hot that they were going to scorch the clothes. And so what we have on display on the image on your right is a sad iron, which is kind of your basic iron. You'd have to wrap a towel around the handle so you don't scorch your hand. The one on the far right is a later invention. So it's got a wooden handle, so it doesn't conduct the heat. And the big box there was for holding a coal, so the iron would be hotter longer. And then in the back is a fluting iron. So with all the, fancy ruffles and pleats and things that went onto garments, a fluting iron would help to kind of press those into shape. So with all the labor involved in laundry, and it was considerable, from the hauling water, the boiling water, which would have been uncomfortable on a summer day and uncomfortable on a winter day, the scrubbing and wringing of garments, all of that made laundry the very first thing that people would delegate to someone else. If they had any disposable income, people would hire a laundress. And that goes back to that letter I quoted from Molly Raymond, who says, you know, my washing has come back. And in a separate set of letters, her mother is writing to that same sister that she was writing to and says, well, if you can get a servant out there and she can do your washing and ironing, that'll be worth it. And then later on, you know, well, if that servant gives you trouble, but she's still doing a good job with your washing and ironing, keep her on because it's worth it. So again, that's the kind of first thing to give away. And so for women, this turned out to be something of an entrepreneurial activity. Domestic servants in the 19th century tended to be drawn from the white working classes, the immigrant classes, African-American women. And so doing laundry, although physically demanding work, also was an opportunity for a woman to go into business for herself in a way that was often seen as preferable to being a live-in domestic servant. A live-in domestic servant might also, of course, be given the tasks of doing laundry. But if someone were to become a laundress, she functioned more as an independent contractor, and this is someone who either would go from house to house to do laundry or take laundry into her own home. And in either case, she has her own space. So at the end of the day, she can retreat to her house and not, you know, be 24/7 on call in someone else's house. She can choose her clients. She can choose the way she wants to do the laundry. If she's doing laundry in her own home, she can mind her children while she's doing laundry. So again, this is an avenue to self-support and sometimes economic freedom for women who became laundresses. And so finally, I'm going to wrap up the presentation with a section on recycling clothing. In the 19th century, as aware as everyone was of the cost and labor that went into making and maintaining clothing, things were never tossed away. Every bit of fabric lived a very extended, useful life, and every bit of usefulness was squeezed out of it. So clothing that could no longer be worn and was no good for children's clothing anymore might be cut down for rags or for diapers or remade into something small here. We've got a rag doll from around 1850 on display. Again, this is something that many small children would make themselves or make the clothes for as a way to practice their sewing. We also have a housewife down there, and this is a sewing kit. It's made of scraps of fabric and turns into a little pretty thing that could hold needles and thread and buttons, and often soldiers off to war would carry a housewife made by their own wife or female loved one, and have all the kind of necessary things on hand to do their own mending. A big aspect of recycling in the 19th century is the collection of rags to make paper. So the paper industry prior to the Civil War depended on the use of linen and cotton rags. And actually, you know, sometimes we think of paper, if it's old-fashioned, as being very like brittle and yellow and falling apart. That tends to be later 19th century paper when they switched to wood pulp. Early paper from the early 19th and 18th century is usually actually in pretty great shape because of that cotton and linen rag content. It tends to survive a lot better. And so there's no real way of rags. It's this industry, the paper industry, that depends on people's cast-off products. So there's this whole economic system set up where women are encouraged to save their rags to give to the paper industry. And this is a notice that appeared in the paper in 1842, rags, rags, clean white paper rags taken in exchange for goods. So women could take their rags to the country store. Often there would be itinerant peddlers that would go door to door. And so you can either trade in your rags for goods or for credit, or sometimes sell them outright for cash. And so this white rags bag that we have there is on loan from the Chester County Historical Society for this exhibition. And this is a wonderful example of something that probably would have been in sitting rooms across America, just simply a bag to collect rags in. They're saving their white rags so they can take it to the store or give to the peddler to be turned into paper in exchange for some money. And so the amount wasn't huge, but one of those advice manuals advised, you know, it's enough to buy some spool and a thread, so it's worth it. Or often children would be put in charge of that, and the rag money was kind of their pocket money. And this happens in, again, Little Women, where Amy couldn't afford her limes because it wasn't her week for the rag money yet. And incidentally, the processing of rags also provided an avenue for employment for women. It was considered women's work. So women were employed in these paper-making factories. They would pound the dust out of clothing. They would cut off the seams and the button hooks and the buttons, and they would cut them into squares that would be used to make paper. We have rag rugs, which is a use for especially woolen clothing. Wool was not used for paper, so woolen clothing, there was limited things you could do with it to extend its useful life, but one of those was to make a rag rug. And so this was something that was kind of common, like so common that rag rugs don't really survive in huge numbers from the 19th century because they were considered utilitarian and they were used, you know, people stepped on them, they ground dirt into them, they were used until they were worn out and not, you know, saved and given to museums as precious artifacts. So we're kind of happy to have the one that we have. And to make a rag rug, you would take old clothing that was past its useful life and cut it into strips, and then you could sew those strips end to end, which was considered another job to stick children with on a slow day. And then it could be this one's a braided rug, so braided into a circle. It could be woven on a loom with a cotton warp, or it could be hooked. And unfortunately, we don't have examples of those. We just have this one braided rug. And then finally, quilts. So quilts, there's something of a misconception surrounding quilts. They are not generally receptacles of old clothing, although the note that came with this one said that this one was made of old skirts and suits, which is kind of made it a neat outlier. Typically, women made quilts out of remnants from clothing before it was made. So, you know, their scrap bag essentially was turned into quilts rather than from cut up old clothing. This isn't a hard and fast rule. You know, if women were poor, if they're kind of on the frontier and far away from a commercial network to buy fabric, they might certainly reuse their quilt scraps. But typically women who are doing quilting in the 19th century are often buying their fabric specifically for their quilts. Quilting is an expression of an abundance of fabric, not a scarcity of fabric. So women who are doing these intricate designs would often, you know, purchase their fabric especially for quilts. But then again, we do see instances like this one where you dip into the scrap bag and turn them into something useful here. And so the kind of questions I want to leave you with in reflection is questions about if you know how to sew and mend, and if you practice that in your everyday life, and if anyone wants to comment that in the chat, and if not you, who in your family? Was it a mother? Was it a grandmother? Was it a, you know, father or uncle? Who in your family knows how to sew, and is that something you practice now? Also, what are your practices of mending clothing? Do you mend to any degree or do you not? For my part, I can clumsily sew on a button and I can clumsily fix a ripped seam. It's not going to win any awards, but it does the job. But patching and darning is beyond me, so I'm inspired by Sam, and I hope that movement only continues to grow. And then what happens to your clothing at the end of its useful life? Where does it go? And so for me, I tend to donate to Goodwill. Beyond that, I'm a little fuzzy on, although it's something I think we as a society need to start thinking about, because in researching this exhibition, I came across horrendous figures of how much clothing winds up in landfills and oceans. And so clothing being thrown out is actually a pretty serious threat to environmental health that will probably need to be addressed sooner than later. So kudos to Sam and everyone who chimed in to say that they mend, because you're doing your part for sustainability on this planet. So this is where I wrap up. I just want to make a note that this is my email address here. So if you have any questions about anything, feel free to shoot me an email and I would be happy to answer it if it doesn't get answered tonight. I do hope you get a chance to see the exhibition in person if you haven't yet, which will run again through the end of May. And I have been given permission to let you know that the Illinois State Museum shop is back and it is online. So we do not have a physical shop, but we have this beautiful online shop that was put together by our retail manager, Stephanie Smith. This is technically just for Illinois State Museum members at this point, but because all of you were kind enough to tune in, you too get access to the shop. So the address is down there. It's shop@illinoisstatemuseum.org. If you are not already an Illinois State Museum Society member, this would be a great time to join, because members get 10% off in the shop, and through the holiday season, they will actually get 15% off. So I hope you will check it out. I do want to mention that, and I'm going to stop my share here. So this is the Fashioning Illinois Lookbook. It's a full color book that shows highlights from the exhibition. And this is for sale in the shop for $10. And we also have these wonderful masks. And this print on the mask is inspired by an 1830s dress that's on the exhibit as well. So also for sale. So with that, I will welcome any questions. I'm happy to tackle any historical questions, and luckily Sam is still here who can tackle any process and sewing questions. So thank you everybody for tuning in.
And we are at about 15 minutes over time at this point. So maybe just one question or two so that we can get, just be respectful of people's time. One of the questions, Erika, that I thought we should definitely cover was, do museums wash clothes that contain starch? So is that something washed out?
Short answer, no, for two reasons. I don't want to, not being a textile expert myself, I don't want to do anything to a historic fabric. So when things are in need of cleaning, we have a conservator that we work with who knows the proper conservationally sound ways of cleaning fabric. But in terms of an artifact, I like the starched clothing just because they are so of the period. This petticoat obviously wasn't washed. It came to us starched. No one had washed the starch out of it. And so it's so indicative of the time period, and it's such a little ephemeral detail of the time that you can't really appreciate until you see the actual object.
One other question was, is silk, how was silk laundered? Because that's something we don't generally launder today now that we have dry cleaning, etc.
Right. So silk was generally used for outer garments or maybe for neck cravats and stuff. So the basic principle is to launder what's close to your skin. So hopefully your chemise or your shirt or your corset and all that is providing a buffer against ick for the silk in terms of, body sweat and oils. In terms of spot cleaning, it would have been spot cleaning. You would have brushed the dirt or dust off of it, and those domestic economy manuals were full of receipts in the back, you know, to take grease from silk, to take ink from silk, to take blood from silk. You know, there's all these different kind of concoctions that people could mix up in their kitchens that would spot clean. But yes, in general, you know, you don't take a silk dress and like plunge it into a wash tub.
Great. I wish we had time for more questions. You can certainly send those questions directly to Erika, or I will drop my name in the my email in the chat as well, and you can send those to us. I did have one other question, was what are the hours for the museum? So the museum is open right now Tuesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. I will note that it has been announced that Illinois will be going back to Tier 3 restrictions, and that will mean the closing of museums for this Friday. So we will, as far as I know, we will be open Wednesday and Thursday. So do pay attention to our Facebook page as well as our website, and we'll be updating you on what our hours are in the coming days and weeks. We have not learned exactly what that means for us, but we do anticipate being closed. So we do have this exhibit is available online, and I will try to put that in the follow-up email to you all in the coming days so that you can see the photos, read the text and those things. So if you can't get to Springfield to see it, or if the museum is closed and you can't come see the exhibit, we should be able to get that to you. So I want to thank everyone for coming out. We had over 250 people today, and we just really appreciate your support. And thank you to Erika and to Sam for their expertise tonight. We hope everyone has a great night and stay safe.